being a more professional, it's in progress, who basically made me the professional breeder I am today, and who also introduced me to my wife, who's going to be speaking tomorrow. So you might be asking me why I'm telling you all of this. Well, I think it's important to give you a sense of who I am, because I'm both a breeder and a lawyer. And in my experience, that's important, because a lot of people who have spoken to me who have had animal issues have gotten lawyers who don't know anything about birds. And their lawyers always seem to fail them because they don't know what it means to have a bird. They don't know the struggles of cleaning bowls of a sick bird, the joy of breeding a new species. So it's important to me that you guys all understand that I'm both one of you and, unfortunately, a lawyer. So now that you know me a little bit better, let me explain this. Until recently, all of us have basically had to deal with our local Fish and Wildlife Agency, like the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's basically who's regulated bird breeders up until now. And because of that, my main focus has been on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who I have sued many a time. And I think I want to explain to you a little bit about my actions, because I think litigation is really important, because the federal government is a very big bureaucracy, and we're unfortunately little fish. We were a little fish to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who basically has to deal with animal rights groups who are $1 million corporations. And now we're going to be a little fish to the USDA, because the USDA regulates all of the nation's animals and our food supply. So at the end of the day, bird breeders are going to be another little fish in a big pond when it comes to the USDA. My most recent litigation is on behalf of the OPA and the Lineated Parakeet Society. Basically, as you all know, the Wild Bird Conservation Act was passed 30 years ago and has prohibited the import to the United States of almost all parrot species and a lot of other bird species. So the OPA and the LPS were seeking to import cactus conures and green-formed lilies, both species which are prohibited on the prohibited list for import. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife told us basically to F off, so we're suing them. Why are we doing that? Well, because, like I said, we're little fish in a big pond, and the only way you can really get the government to respond to you is through litigation, because the court order is the only thing that really makes the government move. So, with that in mind, I want to explain to you how we got here. In 1966, the Congress passed the Animal Welfare Act, which required the USDA to regulate the welfare of any live, dead, cat, dog, hamster, rabbit, non-human primate, yada, yada, yada. For a long time, birds were not to be considered on that list of being under the jurisdiction of the USDA. In 2002, Congress amended the Animal Welfare Act to include birds not bred for research. That basically means pet birds were now under the jurisdiction of the USDA. However, by 2013, the USDA had still not chosen to regulate birds. They had basically said, we don't want to do this and we're not going to. It was at that time that PETA sued the USDA in federal district court, basically trying to force them to issue regulations relating to birds. PETA lost that lawsuit in front of the district court. The district court judge said, you have the discretion. The USDA has the discretion not to issue regulations, so we're not going to force them to. PETA appealed that loss to the Circuit Court of Appeals and lost again. 2018, the American Anti-Vivisection Society, which is a terrible name, and the Avian Welfare Coalition sued the USDA again, basically picking up where the PETA left off and trying to correct what they saw as some of the mistakes in the PETA lawsuit. In this band. These two groups lost before the district court. They appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals. The Circuit Court reversed the district court, but not on a merits point. They reversed them on a procedural point. They basically said, Judge, you issued a bad opinion, send it back to the district court, reissue a new opinion. At which point, the district court judge didn't didn't issue a new opinion. Instead, the USDA said, we're done litigating this. We're going to settle with these groups. And so at which point the USDA settled and agreed to issue the regulations that these organizations wanted. That date, February 22nd, 2023, is the date that is currently set for the regulation, the final version of the USDA regulations to be published. That's 3 months and 20 days from today. The USDA will issue their final regulations that basically set out what we're going to be, to set out the final regulations that apply to us. That assumes that there's no major changes made to the proposed regulations that trigger an additional comment period. And likewise, that also assumes there's no litigation that enjoins the issuance of these final rules. But for the most part, assume that this is the date that applies to all of us. Okay, so before I tell you what the regulations are, I'm going to tell you where to find them. Because as a lawyer, I find people don't know where to find the law. And I think this is important because not only do I want you to double check me, I want you to double check the government. 9 Code of Federal Regulations, Subchapter 1, Subchapter A, Animal Welfare. That is where the current Animal Welfare Act regulations are published. So these are the regulations that are currently in place for all other animals that are regulated by the USDA. And that is the citation you can find them. And you can plug this into Google and it will take you to this website that's provided by the Cornell Law School. This website is publicly available, it's easy to find, and it's easy to use. You don't need a fancy lawyer platform to find the law. You can go to this website and you can read it through yourself. And this website gives you the best version to read the regulations, because a lot of other ones make them hard to read. This one makes it the easiest to read. Now, I have to emphasize, this is the law. It's not the rumor you hear. It's not what your friend says. It's not something that's posted on Facebook. And most importantly, it's not what your inspector comes and says to you. Because I deal with the government all the time. A lot of time, the people who enforce the law don't know the law. You need to know the law. And this is the law. This is where you'll find it. This is what affects you. So I recommend that everyone go and look this up one day and look what the law actually says, because it's very important to know what the law actually is. So I'm going to go into what the regulations actually tell us now. But before I do that, I want to give a disclaimer. There's a lot in these regulations. I'm giving you a brief overview of the regulations as they apply to breeders. If you're a broker, I'm not giving you information about that. If you're an exhibitor, if you're a free flyer, I'm going to talk about it briefly, but it's not going to be the main focus of my speech. You know, if you're a distributor, I'm not really talking to you guys. I'm talking to breeders, people in this room. So, and I'm giving a brief overview. I'm not here to speak for 4 hours and to bore you all to death. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what points I think might be of most interest to everyone in this room. So first off, who does the regulations apply to? Well, the regulations say no person shall operate as a dealer, exhibitor, or operator of an auction without a valid license. So you're reading that and saying, I'm a breeder, this doesn't apply to me. Well, no, because a dealer is anyone who for compensation or profit delivers, transports, buys, sells, or negotiates the purchase or sale of an animal. What those complicated words mean is breeder. If you're a breeder, you're a dealer under the USDA Act regulations. Now, exhibitors are anyone who exhibit an animal which were purchased in commerce or intended for distribution in commerce or will affect commerce to the public for compensation, such as carnivals, cruises, animal acts, zoos, whether operated or profit or not. What does that mean? Well, obviously a circus is an exhibitor. But I want to point out here that if you're a free flyer and you do an educational show and you charge $100 to cover your costs, well, you're an exhibitor because you exhibited animals which were purchased in commerce to the public for compensation, and you don't need to make a profit. Even though you go and say, I made $0 because I did this, I only charged what my costs were, and I'm doing it for educational purposes, you're still doing operating for profit, not for profit, but for compensation in public. So if you're free flyer, you have to be careful because you might end up being an exhibitor. What are the exemptions? So there's 4 exemptions that I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about them bottom up. someone who buys animals, pets, and does not sell them. So someone here who doesn't have a bird is so interested in birds. Tomorrow they go to the pet shop, they buy a conure, they take it home, and it's their pet. You don't need a license. Someone who sells less than $500 in gross income. Well, we're all breeders. We all know that $500 in gross income of birds is nothing. So basically, everyone who breeds birds is regulated. And note, it's $500 of gross income. So if you say, well, I sold $500, but it cost me $600 to raise these birds, so I made negative $100. Doesn't matter. You still made $500 of gross income. So it doesn't matter if you're losing your money on your birds. You're still going to fall into this. You're not going to fall into this regulation, into this exception. Someone who has less than 4 breeding females. Well, that means you have less than 4 pairs. Or a retail pet store. Now that's the one I want to talk about. And you're all probably thinking, I'm not a retail pet store. I'm a breeder. Well, here's the definition of a retail pet store. A retail pet store means a place of business or residence at which the seller, buyer, and animal are available for sale, are physically present, so that all 3 of them can observe each other. So that basically means if you sell to a person personally, I'm the buyer, I'm the seller, you're the buyer, and the bird is here, and you do the transaction here, that's a retail pet store. Doesn't matter if you don't have a store, doesn't matter if you're a breeder. Like as long as you're doing that transaction all in person, you are a retail pet store. So some people may fall into that exception if you're willing to do that kind of transaction. We all know that kind of transaction is problematic due to bird thefts, due to the fact that many people, the market for bird is national, not local. But that is one exception to this that could get you to not have to be licensed. The exception to the exception, though, is that you can't do that if you're wholesaling. What's the definition of wholesaling? We don't know. The USDA didn't give us a definition of wholesaling, but it most likely will be a plain English definition. So selling of goods in large amounts at low prices to stores and businesses rather than selling of goods to customers. That might be the definition of wholesaling, but that leaves open the question. If you do breeder to breeder sales, if you're a breeder of a rare species and you only sell it to other breeders, are you wholesaling? I don't know. Likewise, if you're a breeder, you sell to a broker who then sells to another broker who then sells to a store. I don't know if that's wholesaling. We don't have a definition, and there's arguments to be made on both sides. So realistically, we're all going to be regulated. That's my personal opinion. I think these exemptions don't give us a lot of wiggle room. I think the way we all sell birds today on the internet, we ship, the value of the birds, the amount of birds we sell, I don't think anyone's getting out. I think in theory, everyone's going to be regulated by the USDA, from the guy with 2,000 pairs to the guy with 5 pairs. It's just the world we live in. We're all going to be regulated. So now that we know that we're all going to be regulated, what do we have to do? Well, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the veterinary care plan. I know a lot of people have concerns about this. So if you're a licensed breeder, you're going to need a veterinary care plan. There's a lot of elements to the veterinary care plan that I'm not going to touch on in detail. The most important thing that you need to know is that you need to have a relationship with a vet who's willing to come out, observe what you do, give it the okay, and periodically come visit your facility and see your birds. So you need to start establishing a relationship with a vet. Any vet. Ideally, it's an avian vet, but any vet will do, so long as they're willing to have that relationship with you and observe your facility and give you guidance. Now, one of the reasons I'm not going to give you all the details about what is in the veterinary care plan is because there is a form that the USDA already provides for a veterinary care plan, and I assume they're going to provide another form like that for birds, which your vet will be able to fill out and assist you, make your life easy in preparing the veterinary care plan. So the veterinary part of this, I'm going to come back to it because it comes back to it in other parts of the regulations. But essentially, you need to have a vet who you can develop a relationship with, who will see your birds, who will provide you some guidance, who will be there if you have an emergency, etc. Cages. Now, this is a rule that I know a lot of people have a lot of concerns about. The USDA has not come out and told us this is the cage you need to have. The general rule that they provide is that primary cages must be constructed and maintained to allow each bird to make normal postural and social adjustments. What does that mean? Your bird needs to fit in the cage. It needs to be able to stand up, open its wings, turn around. Basically, this is another way of saying what the Florida rule currently is. Your bird needs to not be shoved in a little box. I don't think anyone here will have a problem meeting this regulation because no one breeds birds in little boxes. However, your vet basically needs to sign off on your cages because inadequate space can be demonstrated by poor condition, debility, stress, or abnormal behavior patterns. So what does that mean? If you have a bird that's plucked, that might be an indicator that your cage is inappropriate. So it's going to be good when you do your veterinary care plan to have your vet say, look, vet, please go see cage 47. The bird's plucked. It's been plucked since I got it. And that the vet will annotate cage 47 plucked. No reason to believe it's related to cage size. That's your safest bet. If you have plucked birds, if you have an old bird that can't fly, if you have a bird that for whatever reason was born with splayed legs or had a broken wing, have your vet annotate that, go cage by cage number, say, this one's an old bird, this one's a bird with a birth defect, this one's a bird that came plucked. Additionally, your cages need to be free of rust that affects structural integrity. So if you have a rusty cage, that's not necessarily a violation. It is a violation if the rust is to the point that the cage is falling apart, that it easily bends. So you don't necessarily need to change your rusty cages, but my advice is, if you're going to have an inspector come out, one of the first and easy things they can look for is rusty cages. So if you have old rusty cages, it might be time to start patching the rust, switching the whole cage, making improvements so your cages don't look rusty anymore. The other rule is no sharp or jagged edges. I think this is an easy rule for everyone to meet. I don't think anyone has cages with sharp wires sticking out in the middle of it, but if you do, check and make sure that you have no points in your cages, no sharp edges or corners that the birds might hurt themselves. Another rule for cages is they must be kept in good repair and protect birds from injury and restrict other animals from entry. This rule seems basic enough. It doesn't seem to be of any concern, right? Cages must be kept in good repair. We all get that. Your cages can't be falling apart. Your birds, it can't be that situation where one day you got out there and your bird got out of the cage because the cage is falling apart. Protect your birds from injury. We all get that too. Nobody wants their birds getting injured just because their cage is terrible. But restrict other animals from entering. That's a concern for me because restrict other animals from entering makes no sense. Nobody keeps birds in fish tanks. We all keep them in wire mesh. Wire mesh lets mosquitoes through, snails through, lizards through. Hell, we've all even had the occasional mouse in. And just because a mouse gets into the cage doesn't necessarily mean it's a welfare issue. Just like if a lizard gets in or a snail gets in. So the OPA has complained about this, and I've gone through the comments, and other organizations have as well. I'm hoping this will be changed to a more performance-based standard that basically says, reasonably restricts harmful animals from getting into cages. But this is a point to watch that may cause problems and is obviously something that the OPA is very concerned about. Now, battery cages. The current regulations prohibit battery cages. Now, I know maybe not, this is not a particularly common setup, but it is a common enough setup that I want to mention. The regulations clearly prohibit battery cages, meaning if you have 3 cages and they all have common sides, if there's no screen, if there's no solid metal divider, if it's just wire sides, that is prohibited. There are plenty of breeders that I know who breed smaller species like green cheeks in these style of cages without a problem. So it's one of those things that I consider problematic because I think this rule should be changed to be performance-based, basically saying you shouldn't have battery cages unless a vet okays it and there's no obvious signs of health issues related to the battery cages. But going back to talking about the rusty cages, if you're going to switch out your cages because they're rusty, I would recommend against building battery cages, but because as the regulations are currently written, battery cages are prohibited.
Sorry, just to clarify. The battery cage is like if you have 2 cages together, 2 separate pairs, and there's
a common wall. Yeah, a common wall. But if you have like a solid metal divider, that's fine. It's just a common wall that's made out of wire. So food and water. The general rule is that food must be appropriate for birds, must be wholesome, palatable, free of contamination, and sufficient to meet their daily needs. And birds must be fed at least once a day. Basically, what this is telling you is that there's no specific diet requirement. You can feed any diet you want, so long as it's appropriate to the bird. And obviously, it's free of things that aren't food. However, I do have a concern with this regulation, and I'm going to point it out for all of you, is that your birds must be fed at least once a day. A lot of big operations feed once every other day. They'll feed one day, and then they'll check the birds the next day, and then they'll feed again the third day. If you do that kind of if you have that kind of protocol, this rule basically says you can't do that anymore. So, if you're a big enough facility where you feel that you need to feed every other day, you're going to have to change your protocols. The rule also requires that food and any food receptacles must be located to minimize the risk of contamination by excreta, precipitation, or pests. So we've all had the bird that likes to sit on the feeder hatch and poop in the bowl. I mean, I have Quakers, and all my Quakers seem to love to do it. They love to sit on the bowl and poop on the bowl. And also everyone who lives in Florida and has outside facilities knows what it's like when a heavy rainstorm comes. Doesn't matter how good your roof is, your bowls tend to get wet. So if you're redoing cages, it's something to consider is changing maybe the position of your feed hatch to avoid this problem, because you don't want the day your USDA inspector comes is the day that there was a rainstorm and your food bowls are wet. But obviously this is a problem because I think it's unreasonable to say that your birds will never poop in your bowls, and it's unreasonable to say your bowls will never get wet if you breed outside. So water. The general rule is that potable water must be continued to be available in sufficient quantities. If you have an automatic water system like the one in the video, you're going to be fine. However, I have two concerns with this rule. One, there's no definition of potable. So if you live on a rural property and you have well water that's unfiltered, untreated, that you provide it to your birds as it comes out of the ground, I can't tell you if that means the definition of potable. There's no definition of potable. Some might say that that's not potable water. I would disagree, but it's a possibility. The second issue that I see with this is that if you don't have an automatic water system, if you give bowls, we all have the bird who likes to take the pellet, dunk it in the water, and then leaves it in the water. So imagine a situation where your inspector comes by at 4 p.m. and you gave your birds food and water at 7 a.m. and the bowl is with pellets in the water and it looks bad. Well, I don't know if your inspector is going to come and say that's not potable water continually available in sufficient quantity. So my advice is that for anyone who doesn't have automatic water system, I recommend transitioning to an automatic water system, because I can't tell you if a bowl with water at the end of the day is okay under this regulation. Food and bedding storage. So the general rule is that supplies of food, including food supplements, bedding, substrate, must be stored and managed to protect it from spoilage, contamination, and vermin. Basically, your food can't be getting wet and full of rats. However, you do have to keep your open food in sealed containers. So basically, you need to put it in a garbage can with a lid. If you have an open bag of food, you need to get used to putting it in a trash can with a lid. And annoyingly, this also applies to substrate. So if you have a bag of shavings, if you have a bale of hay, if you have a box of corks that you use for your nest boxes, you got to get used to putting it in a trash can, because that's what the rule requires, is that you put it in a trash can with a sealed lid. You also need to keep everything off the ground and away from the walls. So if you're like me and you buy 1,000 pounds of food at a time and you store it in a room filled to the top, and then once the room is empty and you clean out the room and start again, you can't do that anymore. You have to put it on pallets. You need to have space to walk around it. It's not the ideal situation. It's problematic for a lot of people, for a lot of larger breeders, but it's what the current rule requires, is that you have, as currently written, it's what it requires. Also, and this is probably more of interest to smaller breeders, but I'm going to bring it up. You can't use food anymore past the stamped expiration date or sell-by date. So if you're the type of breeder who, at the end of the season, you have a 5 kilogram bag of formula that's halfway through, and you say, I'm going to stick it in the freezer so I can use it the next spring, and it goes past the stamp date, you can't use that rule again, and that food anymore. If the inspector catches you, you get in trouble because you're using food past the expiration date. That same goes for for example, rescues who buy food that's nearing the sell-by date. You're no longer gonna be able to do that because it's past the expiration date. Although it might be the sell-by date that the company says, which is different than the expiration date. If it's past the stamp date on the bag, the current regulation says you can't use it. If you get catch it with it, you'll get in trouble.
Whether it's sell-by or.
Yeah, the rule doesn't make a distinction. It just says the date stamped on the bag. So another problem, a problematic aspect of this rule also is that you can't keep your cleaning supplies in your kitchen. So the rule says you can't have soap, can't have any chemicals that are harmful to the health of the bird. I don't think it's a stretch to say if you pour Ajax on your pellets, that's going to be harmful to the health of the bird. So the current rule as currently written says you can't keep your soap in the kitchen. This is obviously one that I'm hoping will get changed. It seems pretty silly. It seems like an oversight, but basically you can't keep cleaning supplies, no bleach, no soap, no nothing like that in your kitchen. It makes no sense. You can't have it in the food preparation area, which is the kitchen. You store it in a separate area. Yeah, it's a bad rule. So next, you have to identify your birds. I know a lot of us have gotten used to not ringing our birds. Unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to treat it, you're going to have to ring your birds from now on. You don't have to ring them, but I recommend you ring. Basically, the new regulations will require that if you have more than one bird in a cage, you have to identify them. You can either identify them with a ring on the bird, a microchip in the bird, or you can have a little placard on the cage that says this is the species, this is the number of the birds in here, yada yada. Obviously, if you're a facility that's got 50 cages, 100 cages, 1,000 cages, putting a placard on every cage doesn't make sense. You're going to want to leg band your birds. And you can do it with open leg bands. There's no regulation against open leg bands. So, if I started out my collection with birds I bought from other people, a lot of them didn't have leg bands. Over the years, I've put an open leg band on everybody. My recommendation is you start putting an open leg band on everyone. And next year, when you start having babies, ideally you put a closed leg band, but if that doesn't work, put an open leg band. There's no rule against. You also will need to start keeping records. And I know we all sort of keep records, but we all need to keep actual records now. So if you sell a bird, you need to have the name and address of the person who bought it. If they're USDA licensed, you're going to need to get their license number. If they're not licensed, you're going to need to get their ID. You're going to need to document when you purchased the bird, when you sold the bird, when the bird died. You're basically going to have to keep a real log of what happens in your facilities. All entries, all exits, all deaths, all births. Shipping. So a lot of people have come up to me about the concern about shipping unweaned birds. I'm not going to go into the complexities of shipping because really that's going to be governed by Delta and what Delta decides to do in relation to the regulations. But as to unweaned birds, you can ship unweaned birds. However, you need instructions. You need to have instructions that are part of your veterinary care plan. Your vet's going to need to talk to you and say, you're going to need to talk to your vet and say, like, I'm going to ship my birds at 6 weeks. I will ship them 6 weeks or older. I will ship them. When I ship them, I will feed them before I ship them. I will make sure to give instructions that whoever receives them will feed them immediately upon receival. And your vet needs to be like, yeah, that sounds good to me, signed off, and then it needs to be attached to the crate. Basically, this is what Delta already makes you do when they make you say, well, write the instructions, but your vet's going to need to okay your instructions, essentially. Enrichment. So along with your vet, you're going to need to develop an enrichment plan for a social group enrichment plan and environmental enrichment plan. So seems scarier than it is because, for example, environmental enrichment, this is the examples they give. Purchase swings, mirrors, providing objects to manipulate, buried food items, using foraging or task-oriented feeding method, providing interactions with caregivers, yada, yada. What does that mean? So if you have a wooden perch, that's enrichment. If you give vegetables once a week, that's enrichment. If you go up to the cage and say, hey, pretty bird, that's enrichment. So, there's a lot of little things that most of us probably do that count as enrichment. So you're basically just going to have to write that stuff down and say, this is my enrichment plan. On Fridays, I give vegetables. Well, when I walk through the cage, I look at my birds and I say, hi, how's it going? And I make eye contact. And, there's at least one wooden perch in there that I replace every year. And I don't clean the leaves off the top of the cages because the birds like to chew on the leaves. Basically that's it. And you're obviously have to write social enrichment, but your interaction with the bird is social enrichment. And at the same time, if you say, look, I have 10 cages in a row and they can see each other down the line, that's social enrichment. Yeah. Yeah. Don't worry, Debbie, I'll come back around to you. And I want to end on this housekeeping. So the regulations are going to require that you keep your facility clean, in good repair, free of accumulation of trash, waste, weeds, grass, brush control. I started out this speech by telling you we're basically all going to be regulated. Deal with it. Well, and I gave you a lot of things that some of which probably gave you guys concerns. This one is probably the easiest one to meet with because we all have that corner that has the old rusty cages that we may need to throw away, the old piece of plywood that we need to throw away, the tree that's leaning that we need to cut, the brush that's overgrown. If you're going to get yourself prepared to start complying with the USDA regulations, the best advice I can give you is go home, take a walk around your aviary, say what's junk here, and start tossing it out, because that'll be a good start. Yes, Chris.
Like I have a staging area.
Yeah.
I have like curtains I'm working on and cages. I call it my staging area.
Yeah.
It's not in the aviary. How far is it?
Would you like to answer that one in the Q&A afterwards?
Yeah, go ahead and answer that.
Oh yeah, Chris was asking. She was saying that she has a staging area, so places where she has stuff that she's working on, perches, cages, and stuff like that. And how that might be. I'm guessing you're saying, Chris, that's a little bit messy, right? And so how far away does that your mess? How far does your mess need to be away from your birds, right? So no, my current understanding is that the vet doesn't need to be USDA certified. They don't even necessarily have to be an avian vet. They just have to be a vet. And currently the USDA does provide a checklist basically for the other animals that are regulated by the USDA. I'm assuming, we're going to ask Cody this later, but I'm assuming they're going to provide an updated checklist for birds to provide for the vets.
I know that Florida, they have a rule that requires you to have cages to put the birds in case of the birds.
Mhm.
I live in California. We don't have hurricanes except we have earthquakes. Now, are they going to regulate us to have structural design or outdoor stand an earthquake?
No. Oh yes, I'm sorry. So I'm sorry. Your name, sir?
George.
George. George was asking if they're going to regulate the structural integrity of the facilities. George, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. That's a good question for Cody though, because Cody, we're going to have a Q&A next, and he can answer that question better than you. But I don't expect that to be the case. I believe that's more of a local. I'm sure that's more in your local, the purview of your local authority. So whatever your local government requires. But anyway, so as I was saying, this is a good place to start. If you're thinking to yourself this is too much, I think this is a good place to start. Walk through your aviary, give it a clean, throw away some junk, and feel that you're taking the first step towards being USDA compliant. Finally, this is my contact info. That's my direct phone number. That's my direct email. Yeah, unfortunately, I do answer. I have a mental illness called answering my phone. So yeah, let me finish it up. So this is my direct contact info. Once the USDA regulations are finalized, I'm going to provide consulting services to large aviaries, to small aviaries, to whoever. If you do call me, please mention that you're an OPA or an ASA member. Obviously, I'll treat you better than Joe Schmo. I'll be nice to you compared to how I treat everybody else. But seriously, I'm very happy to talk to people, their concerns, address them. You know, if you have a big facility and you want me to come out and be your consult, I'll be more than happy to. If once the regulations are finalized and your USDA officer comes and starts telling you things that you think are wrong and you need someone to defend you, I'll be there to defend you. Just give me a call and I'll be more than happy to represent you. You know, I'm in the same boat with you. I'm gonna have to get USDA license just like the rest of you. So by all means, give me a call and I'm happy to help you out. And you know, my last point, the OPA has commented on the USDA regulations. The OPA has several concerns that I haven't, some of which I've given you today, others which I haven't. The OPA, if the USDA doesn't comply with, doesn't address our concerns adequately, the OPA does intend to sue on the USDA regulations. And while I have the money put aside already for that litigation effort, you know, if you want to donate, I would appreciate it because every dollar makes it easier for me to fund this litigation if and when it becomes necessary. At opabirds.org. Yeah, opabirds.org. Or you can call me and I'll send you a link. But yes. Yeah, or I'll be at the I'll be around. Talk to Sarah. Sarah's my lovely assistant. Sorry? Oh yes, Melanie also could help. Thank you. But yes, I mean I'm more than happy to help anyone in this room, anyone who breeds birds. I like I said, I'm a breeder. I'm just like one of you, so there's no problem. Yes, Carrie. Yes, you will. Yes, unfortunately, that's how the federal government, that's the federal system of government works. Oh, yes, Carrie Allen was asking. Carrie Allen's here from Florida. She was asking if she's still going to need to be licensed with her local authority, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. So yes, if you are licensed with your state authority in whatever state you're in, you will still have to be licensed with your state authority, even though now you're licensed by the USDA. Yeah. Chris is asking who would trump the other one. What authority would trump? Chris, that's a complicated legal question that is not within the purview of my speech.
You can call 305.
I have two questions about what you spoke about earlier. I'll keep our baby birds and eggs. So
Yes, that's yes. Yes, I wasn't talking about that. I don't think there's any problem with you keeping your baby. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, sir. Someone was asking. I'm sorry. What was your name? Lori was asking. You know, that I made a comment that we can't keep our birds in fish. Nobody keeps their birds in fish tanks. But yes, some people do keep their babies in fish tanks. I don't think there's any problem in the regulations with that. That was more of an imprecise joke.
had to bring it up despite that was
But yes, no, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I don't think keeping your babies in fish tanks will be a problem.
I think if they have automatic water and you still have a regular bowl, because I'm automatic water, but I still worry about the birds. They need to have water, they need to bathe.
Mhm.
So are they gonna have a problem if you have a dirty water bowl for their bathing bowl and then still have automatic?
Yes,
Yes.
that could very much be a problem. And if let me or if you don't mind, I would direct you to this video that I put in here for I actually put it. How do I play this video? How do I play this video? So Laurie, these are my birds. If you watch, one of them pulls the nipple and the other one bathes in the bottom. So you can actually get them to bathe with the automatic water feeders.
But those
Yeah.
are smart birds. You get birds like after the grace that aren't smart.
I've seen all birds.
Right, you figure out how to take a walk.
I don't know.
So that's a smart bird. That's an unsmart bird. I love grace.
What's your other thing?
Those sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be. Okay, yeah. So, sorry, let me get one more in the room.
Did
Okay,
your other birds learn
yeah,
to do that?
they all do that.
They all.
Yeah, yeah.
I have mostly hornbills. The hornbills don't.
So
That
we're
could be an issue, guys, but water bowls in for some reason.
we're gonna bring that up with Cody at the Q&A because most likely hornbills, I don't think you will need a license if you're just a hornbill breeder. Okay.
So on the 22nd, what do we do?
So on the
Contact them or-
So on the 22nd will be when the final rules are published. So you can go and look what the rules actually say. There's going to be an effective date, which will likely be 90 days from that date. And in the rules, they'll tell you, okay, you have 6 months to apply or something like that. They're going to give you they'll like you.
They give you a outlet, how to fill things out.
We're going to ask Cody. We're going to ask Cody that one.
Okay, so questions online is like, are nest boxes considered enrichment? Everyone's silence. Your God is speaking. Thank you very much. First question is, are nest boxes considered enrichment?
So Dr. Club, not to put you on the spot, but I'm assuming if you had a facility that wanted to be registered and said my nest boxes are part of my enrichment, would you consider that part of the enrichment?
Yes, I would.
So I think it's Dr. Club approved. I think you're good.
We're good.
Would you like to give me your info so I can put it up on the board as well?
Next question, are USDA inspectors going to be licensed in the state that they are inspecting?
There's no requirement about it. Nothing's been said so far. I don't think it's going to be a requirement. If you have a traveling vet that you use, I think it should be acceptable.
And the last question right now is the USDA inspecting person to search for the I can't read it. I'm drunk. What can I say? Drunk on life.
And recorded.
I guess Yoshida knows you. So is the USDA expecting us to voluntarily certify, or will they be looking for us? So you're going to have to voluntarily register, but we can ask Cody how much he wants to look for us. But I'm assuming they will probably do some digging. But as the lawyer, I have to give you the legal advice, which is comply with the law and register with the USDA. What's
There's a fee.
Yes, there will be a fee. I don't know the price off the top of my head. Yes, Karen.
So, in my
Mhm.
and the other half is in pockets. So when USDA comes to inspect, will they be?
Okay. So Carrie's question was she has two businesses. One is the Bird Gardens of Naples, her rescue, and the other is Can Do Carpets. Carrie, you sell carpets? I didn't know that. I've known you a long time, but I didn't know you sold carpets. And so my understanding is you keep your pet birds at Can Do Carpets.
Yes.
Okay. So my understanding of this is that you would be registering Bird Gardens of Naples, and that would be the part that you're licensing. It's that business that would be needing a USDA license. So as long as your personal birds in your house are not part of that business in any way, you don't show them, you don't breed them, then I would say that you could legally deny the USDA access to your house just because you have birds in the house, because those are separate from, well, yes, but that it's separate from the what is the exhibit business of Bird Gardens of Naples.
More questions?
No, let me do these first since I've
Okay, yeah, there we go. So if someone wants to do a small outreach program to local schools, would that require a USDA license?
yes, that's an exhibitor.
And
No compensation.
Well, if you're doing it for zero compensation, then you're probably fine. But if it's like I said in the beginning, if they reimburse your costs, then it's a sticky line.
It's required, well, we do that for our schools, but we
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's probably it's safer to skew towards licensing in that situation.
Is it okay to video the inspection for transparency?
Yes, always video record law enforcement. As the lawyer in me tells you, always do that.
Oh, good Lord, these questions.
Yeah, if you want to, you want to switch this to Q&A? Yeah. Okay. Let's transition over to the next event. Yes. We're gonna do the Q&A with the USDA now, and so any further questions, let's take them together with the USDA.
Perfect, great, thank you, David.
This was on Zoom. We're going to be switching over real quick, but we're going to stay on this video.
To pull the.
Yeah, hold tight for a few minutes. Okay, everyone, we're about to start back to it. Dress down.
Let me go see if I can find. You might. The bar. Yeah. Well, is just quickly go down the line, introduce it's very big. You've introduced yourself already. But each one of them is going to do it very quickly. Cody has a little short thing he wants to say, and then we'll go into the question. At the end. Okay.
And technically an hour, but you're more likely going to be on here.
Oh, great. Everybody, when you get things started again, please take your seats and be quiet. I'll be quiet now. So we're going to get started with our USDA Q&A. And we're going to start very quickly. David just introduced himself. You remember him from 10 minutes ago or so. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Cody first, go down the line, introduce everybody. I'll be down at the end. Cody's got sort of a brief statement addressing some of the concerns already. He'll make a little bit of a comment, and then we'll open it up to questions and things like that. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I hate I just hear the echo. So hopefully no one has any vegetables or fruit. Okay, nothing in the hands, nothing I don't see. Okay. So if you haven't already met, my name is Dr. Cody Yager. I'm the avian specialist with USDA. Before that, I was an inspector out in Ohio and then a supervisor out in Texas. I'll just continue to let everyone else introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. It's been interesting to be here. I'm Dr. Charles Palmer. I'm in Southwest Florida.
So before I introduce myself, so who's our Florida residents, breeders, folks? Okay. So okay, nice. All right, awesome. So one of the cool things about this opportunity today is that we get to meet some of your inspectors. So we got a Southwest Florida person. I'm Dr. Kirsten Napoli. I am the supervisor for the Southeast region. So Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands. So in terms of that, I'm also here to hopefully answer questions and clarify some ambiguities and things like that you guys have. We're here to kind of take things in and support you guys as well. And
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Colette Kirk Al-Amin, and I'm an inspector in Palm Beach County, Florida, South Florida.
Hello, I'm MarioMercado. I'm a veterinarian and I'm the inspector in Southeast Florida, so I'll be David's inspector.
Very good.
So, if you have any questions, but yeah, I'm here to help. And if I don't have the answers, Cody and Kristen will have.
Okay, and I never introduced myself for those who don't know me. Steve Duncan, past president and everything else for ASA, as well as being involved in OPA. But I'm going to sit down here at the end. That way we have USDA surrounded. So I think you have it.
Okay, so I want to first give a quick reg update of where we are. And David was 100% correct. February 22nd, that's D-Day. that is most likely when the final rule will be published for everyone to see. And I agree with David. I do want you guys to look at the regs, and you guys can look at the proposed regs. I feel like I'm getting an echo. Do you guys hear that, or is it just me?
Yeah, it's feedback from this thing. I can't do anything about it. I'm not God.
Oh, but close enough, right?
I'm close enough.
But if you go in the Federal Register where we had the proposed rule, I know there's a lot of, it's a huge document, but if you scroll all the way to the end, it's like the last 10 pages, that is the actual regulations. You'll see the husbandry standards, and then you'll see the transportation standards. So I do encourage you to look at that and read that. And then when we put out the final rule, that it will be key that you look at, and any questions, you jot them down and you ask your inspector, me, Kirsten, anyone, okay? Now, there's a couple things I'm going to disagree a little bit here with David. So our inspectors, our supervisors, everyone in animal care, the regulations are our Bible. We have a laminated copy we carry with us every day on inspections. Yep. Inspectors, do you agree, right? Yes. They know it backwards and forwards. They have looked at probably the regulations a million times. And so they do live by that. What else was I going to say? So going to the standards. Okay. I know there's a lot of questions you guys have. Well, it said about this. What about this? What about battery cages and all that? That was a new one to me. I didn't realize that we had outlawed battery cages. So that's in there. I would encourage you guys to look at that and read that. I can't talk about the standards right now because we don't know what the final, answers will be. We don't know what the final regs will be. I know it was presented to you today right now that, hey, this is what it currently is. And it is, that's what's in the proposed rule. But the reason why we do this proposed rule comment period is to get those comments, which we received from your organization, along with, was it 19,521. I looked at every single one of those comments. We have addressed every single one of those comments. And so what's in the proposed rule will most likely have some differences in the final rule. So I don't want to sit here and talk about, well, what about this? It says, expiration dates. Well, if that's not in the final rule, what's the point of talking about, right? And so I also will disagree with David about saying that everyone's going to get licensed. I don't know about you, but I don't think we don't have the funding to have 20,000 inspectors, okay? And I can promise you that what we do not want to inspect hobby breeders. We are wanting to inspect breeders who have a substantial amount of income from their breeding practices. And we're just talking about breeding. We're not targeting hobby breeders. And we put that even in the proposal. So you're asking about, right, you're asking about the de minimis, which we call, or what are the thresholds for licensure? Do you have to have 4 breeding females, 10 breeding females? I don't know have the answer. You will have the answer come February 22nd. What?
Does it have to be on my?
Just for you, just for your birthday. And it's going to be a birthday present for you. So for today, here, when you have those specific questions about, hey, what does the standard say about this, this, and this? I can't give you an answer, okay? But what I will do, so we look at, of course, mammalian species. Guess what? They do a lot of similar things, such as poop in their water. Or like hyenas, what they'll do is they'll take their decaying meat and let it ferment in water for weeks at a time. We have to deal with that kind of stuff. Do we cite everything? No, on that. So we're going to talk about that with the inspectors. Is that what kind of things are you looking at? Okay. Any other comments I wanted to make initially? I think that's about it. Are we going to go right into questions then?
No,
I think so. I mean, I don't. Did you have, Kristen? Do you want to, or Anyone have anything to say? I mean,
Here, I'll just.
yeah.
I used to be on the stage, so I'm all on it. I guess the only thing I just wanted to add is that, this opportunity was presented to us to attend, to be amongst you all, because we want to take it all in. So thank you for having us. I mean, we know Dr. Yager, of course, would obviously need to be here because, you are the man for birds. But, this is an opportunity for you guys to kind of get to know your inspectors, kind of know our styles, because like Cody said, like we do follow the regulations to the letter of the law. I understand there's that perception of subjectivity, but again, that's also kind of the role I wanted to play too. So by me being present, my job is to ensure that we are sticking to the letter of the law. So, but again, I'm just thankful to be here. We all are all thankful to be here because we're also just people too. I want you guys just understand we're doing our job. We're employing the regulations, and we want to achieve compliance together. So I hope that perception of the us versus them isn't. You guys can take it as you will, but we are here. We want to achieve compliance together. So, and that's all I wanted to add.
One other thing. This is not a one-way street. We're here to learn from you guys. You guys are the experts in your fields. Okay, we know some about welfare, but only you know about your facility and your birds, and you guys know a hell of a lot more about the industry than we do. This is all new to us. So when you might have questions for us, we may have questions for you guys too. And so please, we want to hear this feedback, but we also want to hear suggestions. Okay, because this is, like Kirsten said, this is not going to work. It's a one way. It's got to be a partnership. Okay.
In the microphone.
In the microphone, please. In the microphone.
In all honesty, I've dealt with the USDA for years. I was USDA certified back in the 90s. My daughter's now a vet and she's USDA certified, and she's worked with you guys on various animals, and you've been nothing but helpful and reasonable.
He was like waiting.
Some people are really freaked out over that. And I know this kind of situation where you're trying to get information from us is definitely helpful. But I just have a lot of people who've said over the past couple months, year, that they're really freaked out over this. And I don't see that's what y'all are trying to do. It's not like a witch hunt. I mean, you're trying to work with us. And we've had nothing but good when we've worked.
I'm second that. We've been with you guys for
Great.
all our USDA license, we've never failed. And our inspector, so we know you in Texas. But yeah, our inspector, any questions we have whatsoever, our inspector, any questions we have whatsoever, he is always willing to help us. Willing, with no conditions whatsoever. Even if we think it's something illegal that they give us. But yeah, especially the Texas turtles.
Yes.
So we
Good
always
job.
help.
And that's, thank you so much for those words. That's why we're here. We're here for that 4-letter F word, fear. That's the biggest thing that is going to be the hindrance here, is those people that are fearful. What's in the regs? They're going to come out and get me. Oh no, if I ask this question, or oh, they're going to write me up, they're going to take away my birds. That's what we're not here for. Everyone fails when there's that confiscation, okay? And we include ourselves in that. We're here to help you. We really are. It's so much easier, and it's best for the animal, right? And that's our 100% mission. That is what drives every one of us, is helping the bird, helping the animal, and that means helping you guys. Oh, we got questions. Taylor, what? I know they are speaking of breeders, but I deal with rescue communities, and we want to know how the new rule. Okay, so again, thresholds, I can't talk about thresholds specifically with birds, but we can talk about in generalities, okay? Rescue. Rescuing something is not a covered activity, right? You know, it's when the definition of a breeder, right? When you're buying and reselling. So if you're buying an animal and then you're selling it, that covered activity. So when it comes to rescue, we have to look on it a little bit on a one-on-one situation to see, because there's adoption fees and all that. So we have to kind of really evaluate where that line is. So unfortunately, I can't give you like definitely all rescues, because itself rescuing is not a covered activity.
Maybe I'm trying to draw a line, but I see a difference between a rescue and a sanctuary. I'm a sanctuary. I do not adopt out birds. I have no fees at all. If I go someplace, it's 100% donation, but there's no limits, nothing. It's 100% donations. Where do I fit in?
Again, so sanctuaries, again, that's not a covered activity. However, where sanctuaries start to, I see, do covered activity is they do open tours through their facilities, or they charge, or even if they don't charge the tour, they bring in some type of business aspect, and it's affecting commerce, which David went over. The exhibiting is really that affecting commerce. Are you affecting commerce somehow? So being a sanctuary does not mean, right.
Additional comment? No, okay, we're good on the mic then. Yeah, go ahead and have a seat.
Okay. I hate just sitting up here.
Well, that's okay.
I don't think
So-
Cody needs to. I don't think Cody needs to.
I don't think I need a mic.
Donahue is my role, but half the audience doesn't remember Phil Donahue. What was the other? All right. So again, we're going to continue to open up for more questions, but David, did you have some things you wanted to?
Yeah, if you want, I'll start off with one of my questions. There you go. So Cody, we were talking about this earlier, but I'll bring it up for the crowd, because I know there's some people, Roberto, I know you're probably interested in this answer. You define pet bird as parrots, canaries, and other commonly kept in household birds, correct? So, so the question I know, and you were talking about this about with hornbills, are you going to be regulated? Are people who keep soft bills going to be regulated? Raptor birds, those are generally, I think everyone would agree that, you know, a hornbill isn't commonly kept in American households. The same goes for toucans, doragos, etc. So what is your intention, or what do you believe? Do you think those kinds of birds are going to be regulated? If you have a soft bill facility, is that going to be regulated?
Great question. So what I can say is I can't tell you a list right now, okay? It is our intention, though, to look at pet birds and define it. We've already put in the proposed rule, but what we've been doing is we've been talking to industry leaders saying, how do you guys define pet birds? We've been looking at the research. We've been looking, there's several surveys that go through avian clinics that say, okay, what is the species that you see through your clinic each year? We've also been looking at online stores, getting makeups of that. We're putting all those pieces together, along with going to shows, looking at like what kind of species are being sold for pet species, and looking at that to kind of define that. I can't give you like, yes, a hornbill is definitely a pet bird or not a pet bird. We're looking at that. And remember, this is the way in the proposed rule, it said, you know, commonly found in US households. That could change over time, right? So while hornbills may not be the pet species today, 5-10 years from now, if there's a sudden surge and everyone's saying, hey, this is the best pet since sliced bread, that may change over time. I think with that type of thing is it has to adapt over time what those pet species are.
No, go ahead.
So going off something else I brought up in my lecture, if we can have your understanding of what wholesale means, do you plan on defining wholesale, or how exactly are you going to treat a wholesale for the retail pet exemption? Because that's the other question. Because I know a lot of people, And then I think you want a lot of people to fall into the retail pet exemption. So
I have no bird in this fight here.
So I think the question is, where do you draw the line of wholesale, or are you going to define the term wholesale?
I don't have that definition. I can't define it. I can talk to our national policy staff and ask that. Kristen or anyone, you have already read our definition of retail. It is a great question. I have to get back to you on that. Okay.
I'll add a little bit to that. My understanding, I don't know if it's clearly defined in the act or not. But anytime you sell a bird to another dealer who's selling a bird, doesn't matter if it's going to be resold 5 or 10 times. If you're selling to another dealer who resells, that's a wholesale transaction. Period. It doesn't matter, it's still a wholesale transaction in terms of the law. My understanding, I'm not USDA. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, one of the things like I like to try to teach people too is, when you connect that face-to-face sale, just as perfectly as David described it, you, the buyer, if you're the seller, the buyer and the birds all in the same room, and the transaction takes place. Everyone is able to make a judgment on that bird. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, animals are still products, right? Do we approve of that product? Yes, I accept this product. I want to purchase this product. So everyone can advocate for that animal because again, buyer and seller are in the same room. So the biggest wheelhouse where we come into play is when the end owner of that bird is not in the picture. They're on the receiving end, but they don't have a say in the middle of it. Does that make sense? So that middleman, just kind of emphasizing on your point, but that's kind of that's where we come into play because that animal's welfare has not been advocated for that member of that public. The member of the public that receives that animal as a pet at the far end of a train of transportation, when that person cannot advocate for that animal's condition, that's where we come into play because we're there to ensure that the broker or that breeder has abided by the rules and regulations to optimize that animal's welfare and health, so that when the receiver gets that bird at the end, the idea is that they're going to be in a good situation so that they're going to be getting a proper product. Does that hopefully help paint that picture?
Okay, George.
I'm in California and I want to sell a bird to somebody in Virginia. They're not in a room. There's nobody else around. He calls me on the phone and says, I want to buy your bird. I say it's going to cost you X dollars. He says, that's fine. I'll say it's going to cost you ship it, and I ship it to him. Now that's 2 people doing one transaction, but he's not in the room.
Correct.
And there's no broker. So are we exempt in that situation or not?
Nope. Yeah, go ahead. Yes. That would be yep.
So that would not meet a retail pet rule, okay? That would not, so.
Why?
Because you're not in the same room, right? You're not all at one location.
So I gotta be within 10 feet or 20 feet.
And also the point, even if it's a quote covered sale, right? You're shipping,
right?
We have not set thresholds for that. So it still does not mean you definitely need a license. We have to determine that and set that.
Could that be legal off facility though?
Okay, good. Let's not just start throwing out questions because we need to talk into the mic. But I will add something to that topic, just for general understanding of how the Animal Welfare Act works. The reason that rule is in place, we didn't used to have it, but that was because we had a whole bunch of puppy mills, for lack of another term, that at one point were regulated as wholesale dealers. They got around that licensing requirement by stopping wholesale transactions, advertising online, and they were selling lots of dogs online, puppies, without any need for licensure and inspection. So that was a loophole, basically, that was closed in order to protect against these commercial breeders of puppies primarily. That was the reason for that. Am I right there from USDA? Sounds right. Okay. All right, David,
No, I think David was asking a good question.
You have a question.
So that 3-way transaction, broker, breeder, buyer, could that occur off facility? A lot of us don't want the public coming into our aviaries.
So like David, need the mic. Or do I?
So like David said, the definition says at a place of business or residence. Okay, so, and when you say, you said broker, okay, so broker sales are not eligible for retail, okay? This is if the breeder is selling to the pet owner.
And it has to be at a facility.
It has to be at a, like the definition says, like I will always stick to the regulation, right? That's what we want.
Very good.
It says place of business or residence.
So it can't be you don't want someone to come to your place, so you meet them in a parking lot.
Drug deal.
No, that's what I do.
Hell yeah. I mean, it's back to the definition. I mean, the definition says business or residence.
I have, my question is for Dr. Yager. You met with us at the Association of Zoos and Aquariums Conference last spring with our Avian Scientific Advisory Group when we had some really good questions and good discussions. I really appreciate that. One of the things that you are very good at explaining, and I actually have a couple of questions, but the first one is, could you talk about the difference between performance standards and engineering standards to reassure people a little bit?
Thanks. That's a great question. So I say performance standards and engineer standards. What does that really mean? It's kind of like what David said about like the caging. Okay, we purposely did not put hardly any engineered standard, meaning like dimensions. Like for a toucan, you need a 24-inch by 36-inch by 12-inch cage. That's the minimum. We have that for other subspecies. For other species like dogs and cats, we do have minimum cage sizes and guinea pigs and all that. We specifically chose not to do that for birds because of the variety, because of the different types of enclosures, depending on the breeding, depending on the day of the year. I mean, there's hundreds of things that can impact it. So instead, we decided, hey, performance-based standards. Is it working? Is the bird look healthy? Is it addressing their needs or all their behavioral needs? If it's working and it's good. Okay, that's how the standards of proposed rules written. That's how we structured it. And every time we put a new line of regulation, we asked ourselves, does this make sense? Is this for a performance standard and not just a, hey, you got to meet this criteria? Because at the end of the day, we're here, what I said about welfare, we're not here to be, oh, the inspector's getting out the tape measure and say, okay, it meets this, boom. No, we want to say, how's the bird look? Is the bird, you know, displaying its natural behaviors? Is it as healthy and happy as it can be? Okay.
Follow-up question.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's actually not a follow-up, but it goes to something that David was talking about, and that is the exclusion of other animals out of the enclosure that our animals are in. And I've been dealing with USDA inspections with mammals for most of my career, and we know that sparrows are going to fly into the gorilla habitat, and you know, little things things like that are happening. My understanding is that we are careful to exclude predators and other dangerous things, and you know, make sure that we do good housekeeping and husbandry standards and that sort of thing. So if we had some discussion about that back in April, and I know that we added to that with the comments that we submitted and so on, but if you can address that a little bit more, that would be great.
So if we didn't want mosquitoes in the enclosure, we would have said prevent all animals getting in there. We said the word restrict. Look up the definition of restrict. There's the, you know, Webster's definition. It means to limit, okay? So we're going to use, is it impacting the animal? We can't, it wouldn't be great welfare if we said, hey, all birds, they can't have an open top enclosure, right? Because, you know, like the flamingos at the zoo. So restrict is different than prevent. And again, I can't go into, this is what the standards will say, but we did not have the intention of preventing all external organisms going to the enclosure.
Maybe the issue isn't prevent or restrict, but maybe the issue is all animals. You're saying all animals, that's lizards and everything. So maybe that's the issue, not necessarily restrictor. You understand what I mean? You might say all animals, they're saying all animals can't get into the enclosure. Go back and check.
What is it?
I refer back to subpart F, that's the only thing that's currently here. Exactly.
Restrict other animals from entering.
Yeah, it just says restrict other animals from entry.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's.
Right.
But it says the issue.
Yeah, but if the inspectors.
And who knows, that may be addressed. Say that's why I don't want to get into the regs. Yes.
You know, so how are we supposed to restrict a mouse or a sparrow getting into, say, a macaw cage? It's going to happen.
So I'm going to turn it over. Okay, yeah, we have it in, because in the other subparts, we have to look at this as well. So go over to Dr. Palmer.
Yeah. All right. So I enjoy all the questions. Earlier, I said this was interesting. So I practiced in a clinic in Oklahoma City with my wife, and the name was Southside Dog, Cat, and Bird Clinic. So I have some experience with birds, but I sat in the back of the room today, and I can tell you I've never been in a conference where a bird next to me flew by my head, flew around the room. I said, oh my God, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And somebody up here just stuck their hand up and it perched. Imagine how that is for me. And I watched somebody else take their bird and lift it up off the chair and hold it over a trash can. So it pooped in the trash can. They carried it back. So that's totally out of my element. Can you appreciate that? I mean, just totally out of my element. So I heard you giving a technical talk, and you people asked pertinent, incredible questions that blew my mind, that you knew to ask those things. So you guys have impressed every one of us. I want you to know that. So when I come in, there's no way I'm going to presume that I know as much as you. I'm just not going to. I have a basic understanding of birds, and I'm going to have the regulations. Pardon me, that's my guidebook. But when we come in, this is what I tell the inspectors. You need to think of me as the referee at the end of the ball field. Okay, I'm either going to say it's good or it's not good. And if it's not good, guess what? I'm going to help you figure out how to make it good. That's our goal, is to help you. We may not be able to be buddies. We may not be able to walk hand in hand down the path, but we're going the same direction. We could be on other sides of the fence, but I promise we want the same thing. For us, we're advocates for the animals. So when I come in, I'm not nitpicking anything. I a few things in my life. You know what my greatest accomplishment is? I have 4 beautiful kids. And that's what I live for, is my family. I have no desire to get on a soapbox, and I can speak for every inspector I know to go, oh, I'm going to shut you down. You know, that's not what we want. We want what's best for the animal. And in going in, the assumption when I go in is that's what you want, and that you know your animals better than I'm going to know them. You know your facility better than I'm going to know them. So I don't nitpick. When we talk about other animals, you think I don't go to every place that's got a tiger, which is numerous in Florida, numerous. And I see birds in the cage with them. I watch that because I'm interested. How's that bird still alive? I'm watching that tiger. Is that tiger looking at that bird, or is he looking at me? You know, or is he looking at the person I'm with, waiting for a handout? You know, so if we see things that could transmit disease, right? If we see something that could harm that animal, if you've got, you know, we've got pythons down in Florida. If you've got a raccoon, and I'm looking at your raccoon, and in the back of the cage, I see a python come in, I probably have a problem with that. Okay, you understand? But if I see a sparrow come in I'm not getting excited about that. You can't prevent that. Nobody expects you to prevent that. So I want healthy questions and dialogue. That's going to be great for all of us. But understand, we're not trying to create problems for you. You know, we're advocates for the animal. So a lot of times, the answer when you ask me an open-ended question, I said this today, you ask an open question. The problem is the answer is always going to be, it depends. It's going to be based on these things. But if you give us some scenarios, we're happy to tell you what we do in other places. Okay.
And
We got a whole lineup on this one, so when you're done, give it to David.
Okay.
And I'm gonna come back.
And it goes back to the performance standards versus engineered standards, right? So if a mouse is coming in, we're going to say, okay, is this mouse impacting the animal? Is the food look okay? Is this a dying mouse? Do you have disease running rampant through your facility? We're going to see, is there an impact to your animals? If there isn't, then like I said, the animals are looking good, everything's healthy, everything's clean, then to me, that's not a non-compliance.
And do they have a pest control program?
And do they have so we have this in the other subparts, do you have an effective pest control? So do we went in there and there's 20 mice? Now, I don't know where the line is, 1 mouse, 20 mouse, it's gonna, performance. What are the animals looking like? Do they have clean food and water? Does the enclosure look clean? And I gotta give it to David first.
And I understand where you guys are coming from, and we appreciate that you're not looking to come out and get us. But I have to give the lawyer perspective. The statute, the regulation as it's currently written, is open to a wide variety of interpretations. And a lot of people in this room have had bad experiences with Florida inspectors, with any other kind of inspector. And there's one thing is what you promise us today in the room. And the other thing is, if you might be my inspector today, but in 5 years you retire, I get a new inspector who has a different point of view, and you have this regulation that's open-ended, and they want to mess with me, and then I have to take it to court. I know that I'm not going to win that argument because you're a federal agency and you get deference, and that regulation is in favor of your interpretation.
So let me talk about and I understand that point, and you do have some appeals process, okay? So let me talk a little bit about the appeals process. So what happens if Dr. Palmer comes to your facility and there is a disagreement, but Dr. Palmer says, hey, no, after looking at the regs, I think this is a citation, okay? And you disagree. Is that it? Do you have any recourse? You do. Okay, so you can do a couple things. First, you have the appeals process, okay? You have within up to 21 days of appealing that citation. You write to our office saying, hey, I'd like to appeal this citation. These are the reasons why, and it goes to appeals panel. That appeals panel is not Dr. Palmer's supervisor, so it wouldn't be Kirsten. It'd be someone in another part of the country, along with a specialist and either like an assistant director or the director themselves and the director themselves of animal operations. Second is what I would encourage you to is get to know not only your inspector, but get to know the supervisor in the area. So for Florida, it's Dr. Napoli. If you have concerns, you can always talk to her as well. And none of the inspectors feel like, oh, you talk to my boss, oh, you shouldn't do that. Now I'm going to gang up on you. No, we understand there may be disagreements and confusion. When I was a supervisor, I told my inspectors, please, if they are not seeing eye to eye with you, give them my contact. So I would recommend doing that. Also, you can always talk to me too, as the avian specialist, and say, hey, I have confusion about here. I don't see why this is non-compliance. Reach out.
All right, I just have a comment, so I'm gonna piggyback on what Dr. Palmer said, and this is me, Mario. I have like over 100 people with licenses in South Florida. I'm the inspector for from Miami-Dade and Monroe counties, and believe me, we all know that we have all kinds of animals down there, and birds are not even counted yet. So What I tell my licensees is that I'm a team player with you guys. I'm here to bat for you. You know, from those groups that want to get into your facility to just throw tomatoes at you, like somebody said, hey, you know, we're probably there to help you for that not to happen. So we're gonna try to get to where you need to be, so you're in compliance and you don't have any people like those people protesting in your front yard. So just we'll get there. And from what I have seen today here, and you guys, you know, you're an incredible audience. You know, it's like educated and very intelligent, and like you're saying, technical talks here. Wow, you know, blew my mind. You know, I'm a very positive person. You know, my boss knows that. And so I'm always being positive, even though the world could be falling apart around me, but I'm always still positive. And basically, we're gonna get there. And I think you guys have you're probably 50% or more ahead of the game already, because you guys are professionals in this. And like those of you that live in Florida, if you abide by FWC standards, you're already, you know, in a lot of issues ahead with our inspection process. So you'll get there, and I'm pretty sure you guys are gonna be doing good.
Okay, I'm gonna add a little bit to that before I had, what's your name over there?
Mike.
Mike has been sitting here for
He's
about
been-
half an hour waiting.
He's been very patient.
Yes, he's been awesome, so thank you. That's one of the challenges of this, because it's a heated subject and we're all very worried. And that's one thing I want to address from my perspective as a representative of the avicultural community. I get calls all the time from people I've had calls from people saying, should I even build cages right now? Because we don't know what the regulations are going to say. And I tell them, you're fine. Okay. So I'm going to do my best to walk the line. I just talked to them about this earlier. Okay. So this is my approach, take it for what you will. When you hear these horror stories about the regulations and you can't do this, you can't do that, the first thing I do is I think, what do zoos do? Never mind private. You've got a whole zoological industry out there that has all sorts of exotic mammals that are regulated now. The regulations for birds are modeled after the regulations for exotic mammals, for the exact reasons Cody just said. It's not a dog, a cat. It's 10,000 different species of birds. And they all have different requirements. So the Animal Welfare Act cannot write specific requirements for those. So they fall under performance standards that he just explained how that works. So when you hear something about excluding animals from getting into your cages, what does the tiger exhibit do at a zoo? It's wide open, right? Birds can fly in, everything can fly in there. So if they can do it, maybe I'm not, as an aviculturist, understanding what they mean by that. And maybe I'm interpreting that wrong to think that my cages have to be built to exclude all other animals, because that's not how the regulations work. Okay. So this line that I'm on right now is supporting these people up here. But that's not to say that David is wrong as well. Okay. This is still a legal issue, and it is open for interpretation. And we are subject to the next inspector that takes your place or whoever. And honestly, we've seen this happen with Fish and Wildlife Service. Used to be very friendly to captive breeding, and they're not now. And I've seen that change. And that's what everybody in this room is afraid of. Okay. It is very different now than it used to be. It is, right. And so we're very worried about that. So those concerns about language specifics, I understand the final regulations aren't done yet, but that's where it's also coming from. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of my general thing, right? I'm not afraid of these regulations. The zoos have been doing this for decades and decades, right? Ever since the Animal Welfare Act's been in place. And they've been able to do it. And by working with USDA, we're going to develop a good working relationship, as they've all expressed. But they're not coming after, they're being forced by the legal system to do this. It's not their decision to do bird regulations. But they do want to do it as best they can because they're being forced to. And it's following existing regulations. So if something scares you, doesn't make sense, think of what currently licensed mammal facilities do. Are they able to comply? Yes, then I can comply too as a bird breeder. Okay.
Just one other comment on that. So there's going to be some type of implementation period, right? So we said February 22nd, that's when the final rule, that's when everyone knows what's the rules of the game, okay? There's going to be some period of implementation. Now, can't tell you the exact, timeline. What I've seen in the past that other rules, new rules roll out is 6 months. It may be more, it may be less. I mean, the fact that we always encourage our facilities to apply at least 120 days before their license expires, I would guess you probably couldn't have less than that. But my point is that there's going to be some type of implementation period. So you're going to have time to look at the regulations, think about that, and then reach out to the inspector, me, the supervisors in the area, get that, say, hey, how do you define this? Is this a non-compliance? Have them come out to your facility and say, hey, is this correct or not? What would you cite if you were here? And then on top of that, you will have to go, if you have to get a license, you'll have to go through the pre-license process. And that means that we schedule a day, the inspector comes out there with you and says, okay, this is what passes and this what doesn't pass. And you have to get 100% compliance. And then you have up to 2 more times after that to be 100% compliant. Now, saying that, I would say easily over 98% of them pass within the second, pre-license. So, if there's any, non-compliances that are noted, then you correct those and good. So you will know this is the standard here. This is a regulation. I don't know.
Right here.
Before we
go, sorry.
That's you've waited far too long.
Actually, you started to address what I was going to ask you about was on February 22nd, the law will be published. You will then do rules and regulations after that?
So,
or will that come out on February 22nd? And the other thing is, you just mentioned a pre-inspection to licensing. Is that part of the process? We just don't fill out an application and send it in with our money and hopefully you'll say, okay.
So great questions. All right, first one. February 22nd, the regulation. So when I say final rule, that means the regulation. And so what will be published on the Federal Register is the huge preamble, which is a lot of pages. It basically goes over all the comments that we got and while we're answering those comments. But at the end of that section will be the actual regulations, word for word, will be printed in our blue books that the inspectors carry and that the inspectors will go off of. Pre-license. So how the pre-license process works is if you think you need a license, you can always call our office to ask us, hey, this is the kind of activity I'm doing. Do I need a license? If they say, yep, you need a license. We also have on our website, which we're going to update for birds, is was licensing and registration assistant. So it's a series of questions that will tell you, hey, it looks like you do need a license or registration. The difference between license and registration, if you're breeding or exhibiting or brokering, you need a license, an actual license, and you do need to go through the pre-license process. Registration is for if you're doing transportation, like you have a business where you're transporting other people's pet animals or if you're doing research. I don't have any researchers here, so.
Well,
Are you a researcher? Well,
actually,
I assume
yeah.
your facility is already licensed, yes, or registered. So let me just finish up. So for licensing, the pre-license process, so you figure out, hey, I do need a license. You turn in on our website, you fill out the application online. I believe it's $10.
To apply?
Yeah, to apply. I thought there was some type of application fee. It was either like, I think it's $10. It's
No, I'm sorry.
but I can get, I mean, it's on our website, but you basically put in the information and all that. And what it will do is it goes in our system and then it gets sent over to the inspector who's in your area. They'll set up a pre-license call with you and they'll have a series of questions to see how ready you are, see what questions you have. And then if everyone's like, yep, it looks like you're ready, you got everything in place, you got the program of vet care, you got the enrichment plan, blah, blah, blah. Then they'll say, okay, what day and time works for you? They'll come out and do an inspection, but then say, okay, everything looks good, but X, Y, and Z needs to get done. Here, you get those corrected. I'll come back. You have 60 days to get that done, or then you have to wait 6 months and reapply. But usually almost within a week turnaround, the facility has corrected those things and they usually pass on the second one, but you do have up to 2 more tries after that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you're getting there.
Is there a way I can get all the way there?
And how long will the license extend for?
Another great question. So you have, if once you pass, you have to pay $120 as a licensing fee. It's good for
Things
3
you need to
years.
say before.
No, it's good for 3 years. And then you need to reapply before, if you want to continue doing covered activity, you got to reapply before that license expires. And so we recommend 120 days to go through the system and then start up again, you'd have a pre-licensing, but it's a relicensing inspection. So same process. David, I don't want to keep skipping you.
No, I just want I wanted to go off.
You can skip him. No.
I wanted to go off your response.
Oh, that's right. Let me get Kristen. She's been waiting patiently and I'll get back to you.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. The rules are going to be published on February 22nd. How can we impact what rules you're making over us?
Before that night?
I mean, how? I mean, right now, I mean, everything's kind of been a little gray of we'll see, we'll get back with you. I mean, yeah, the second question was when it comes to Fish and Wildlife versus USDA, who be in the end? It's go ask your mother, go ask your father. I mean, I want to know if Fish and Wildlife comes in and says something and USDA comes in and says something different, who do I listen to? I mean,
Well, I'm walking up here. My guess is that they're completely different regulations, so there shouldn't be overlap.
And that's the second question. I mean, we don't impact them, they don't impact ours. And so we can't, I mean, you shouldn't have to decide who to listen to.
but they're both about the welfare of the animal.
No, Chris. Fish and Wildlife doesn't regulate welfare.
Do you want
to? Sorry, Chris. I guess I'll answer this question. The Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't regulate welfare. They have some regulations that say, you know, that animals need to be treated humanely. Oh, are you talking about Florida Fish and Wildlife or the federal Fish and Wildlife? Well, Chris, I've compared the Florida Fish and Wildlife rules to the USDA rules. I don't think there's anything in particular that under the Florida Fish and Wildlife rules that wouldn't meet their standard. But it will be an interesting question if it does come to that.
Well, and maybe yeah.
Yeah, so for Florida Fish and Wildlife, their standards are very, very specific and they have very, you know, very strict guidelines. And we constantly collaborate with them. In fact, we have a meeting with them in January so that everyone's on the same page as to what they do and what we do.
I'm glad we got here first.
I'm going to say
Said I'm glad we got here first.
Sure, absolutely. If you are sticking to the Florida Fish and Wildlife guidelines, you're going to be, well, again, for the animals that we do cover, for mammals that we do cover, you are in compliance with USDA. You know, again, so, but to David's point, we do emphasize specifically on the welfare side, whereas Florida Fish and Wildlife is a little bit more about cage structures, a huge emphasis. The safety of the public. I mean, we definitely obviously have regulations about safety of the public, but in terms of like veterinary care stuff, that may not be their purview, whereas definitely more so ours, like, you know, and that record keeping component. You know, obviously we're in Florida, you already have to have a contingency plan, but those kind of things, those are the standard things that you have to have for the state. You'll be compliant with us as well. And if you please.
So let me help you with that just a little bit. The regulations that we have versus the standards they have tend to complement each other. Their cage rules are much more prescriptive than ours. And if you meet those, you have no problem meeting ours. The standards we have for welfare, if you meet ours, you have no problem meeting theirs. There's no direct conflict in that. There's not one where one trumps the other one. In some areas, they may be more prescriptive, and others, we may be more prescriptive. So the answer is really, you have to comply with both, but they don't conflict with each other. So you don't have a problem.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Chris, so let me just complete the lawyer thought for you. What he basically said is correct. You're going to have to comply with both. If we ever get into the situation where you have to do something for Florida Fish and Wildlife that contradicts something that they say, most likely it's going to be their rule that wins because of the supremacy clause. The federal government usually beats out the state government. But from my review of both, I haven't seen any point where there'd be a direct conflict. But if there ever comes a direct conflict, assume you have to comply with them before you have to comply with the Florida government. Yeah.
And I did want to answer your first question about how you can affect. All right, so we had a comment period. That's when we put out the proposed rule back in February. We first had, we said 60 days, we then extended another 30 days. So you had 90 days to comment on that rule. So you say, well, I mean, so, right. And so what we did is we sent out messages to stakeholders, to stakeholder groups. But remember, the law is always an evolving thing. And so, well, maybe this, regulation, when it's finalized, talk to your congressman, talk to your representative. I mean, it's a legal, lawful way of changing the regulations. I mean, this is how we got to today too. So there's always updates and all that.
That's right. I'll get you out of trouble. Okay, one moment.
I have to say, the fact that this is past 6 o'clock on a Thursday and we have this engagement.
We have several here.
Okay.
Just a 5 second follow up here, and then we keep going. No, just to piggyback on what David was saying, just to remember, FWC, basically they're looking after the safety of the public primarily. That's why they give you specific things for your enclosures. We are basically, we're the ones asking you for the welfare, the veterinary care program, because that's what we do. We're vets. Most of us are vets or vet techs or veterinarians. So that's the main big difference. And again, for as far as the engineering, like we were saying, you're there already. So
okay, great. Lots of hands up. Betty, I'm going to get to you after. I think we had some online.
Yeah, Steve,
stuff.
I'm going to ask the online question.
Okay, go ahead.
So we have one person here asking about battery cages. So, and the battery cage issue, I want to bring it up with you guys directly because the people who tend to have battery cages are not the 100 pair facility. It's the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pair facility. I know one facility, one large facility in Florida that probably has 1,000 battery cages. And so we were talking about, it's a concern. Is that going to go forward? I know you're probably not going to answer that, but the way I want to tie that into, I think, how you can answer it is, you were talking about the implementation period and the pre-inspections. If you have 1,000, if you decide to ban battery cages, this guy has 1,000 cages. It's, that's $100,000, $200,000 worth of wire that has to be replaced, $100,000 worth of labor, months of work. Is that facility going to be shut down until they change all those battery cages over? What are you going to do with that massive facility that makes $1 million a year and is a big business that you're now shutting down because you're saying, oh, you can't have those cages?
Explain again the battery cage.
Yeah.
Is that 2 walls or no wall?
A battery cage is at least one adjacent wall that's unscreened. So you have 2 cages next to each other. The divide.
By toes.
Yeah. So
It's
they
a single wall.
Yeah.
What if it's double wired for the space?
If it's double wired, it meets the regulation.
I mean, I can't really talk about it because, again, it's the standards. I don't think we use the word battery caging in the proposed.
You don't use battery.
And again, going off of performance, the person who has thousands, I mean, is that working, or are the birds attacking each other through the cages?
Well,
I mean,
it's working, but your regulation specifically prohibits it.
I don't see that. So, but again, I can't talk about the standards because we don't know what the finals look like. All right.
It was next. I'll get to you. So keep raising your hand.
Dr. Yager, excluding attrition, how many new inspectors have been hired and how many more inspectors will be hired to take this on? Or is it just one inspector over here said he sees about 100 facilities? Does that mean you got to see 500 when this comes in, or are you going to hire 4 or 5 more inspectors?
So I don't believe we've received any additional funding. I don't know if that, will change or not. I don't think, and Dr. Napoli would know better than I would, I don't think we've hired any additional folks just because of birds. And I have no idea till we get whatever funding we get from Congress, then we just can decide if we can hire more or how that is.
So, David.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Funding.
Try to
On the
keep it
bottom,
organized
last
here. Was there another online one? No, we're good. Okay.
Came up with FWC at one point. Will our licenses and all our information be public?
Yes, so there is a publicly accessible called a public search tool. So your license number, I mean, nothing like your address, things like that. That's,
Yeah. But Fish and Wildlife, they can buy a list and know what we have, where it is.
So, so ours is going to be, so the public will be able to see inspection reports, so compliance histories. And again, so if people want to search it, that's part of us being public servants, because we're here for the public to ensure that those animals are well protected. But that's.
I missed that point, sorry.
About addresses being present.
So address, yeah, that's a great question. Right. What type of, so we run into this though, right? We run into this to the animal side of things. You can use a post office box. If that's your business address, you can use that. Okay, that answer that? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a published address, but you can use an anonymous address as a PO box. Hang on, we got lots of questions.
Thank you. Hi, can we talk to everyone about your used car warranty? My question is, what teeth are there in this law? Is it going to be like the turtle law where it's illegal, but there's no fines, nothing can be done to them. What can you guys do to a radical person that we would not want working around us?
If we have rogue inspectors or
So you're-
problematic.
Wait,
I think it's called.
what do you, what,
Oh, bad breeders.
are you talking about?
If you come to my house and inspect me, and my place doesn't meet your standards, what can you do to me if I refuse to cooperate other than beat me up?
Why does everyone want to focus on the negative, right? I see that you guys are here, you want to, we're all just gonna get along and we're gonna, yeah, this is it. No, it's always like, no, what's the worst possible thing that could happen? And I understand that. And I understand there's fear and yeah, you need to know. So it's administrative law. There's no criminal charges or anything like that. There's a long process when it comes to enforcement. So you're talking about enforcement. You know, we've gone through, you've worked with the inspector, they've educated you, done all that. Citations are written, multiple ones, repeat citations, serious animal welfare concerns, you know, and it goes to enforcement. I'm not an enforcement person. I don't know. I mean, there's a series of enforcement options from fees to 70s, 60s, which is like an official warning. So, and yes, there is the possibility of confiscation, but it is extremely small that we do. And it hasn't got, those animals have to be in dire need. And we are not Fish and Wildlife, so I can't speak to that. But those animals are severely suffering when we confiscate. And it is, I've been with animal care for 10 years. I've been involved with 3 confiscations.
I think I could summarize that really quickly. There was an online, is a different question. Sorry, and I'll get back to the audience. Somebody's asking about dietary requirements. Is there going to be any specifics other than the general performance standards?
I can't talk about this because it's not that I don't know, it's because it's going through. So right now it is at, we have another week or two at the department level that they're going through all of our lawyers and all through the different people that have to look over and make changes. So changes are going on. And then it has to go through OMB, which is the entire federal government review process. And they go and talk to other agencies to see how it impacts and all of that. And so, you know, from the proposed rule, there was no restrictions in dietary. I don't think in the comments, I didn't see anything in there that was requesting dietary additions in there.
We've had lots of hands up and we're going to wrap it up pretty quickly because we've gone like a whole hour. Yeah, and we have another event. So I know we've all got questions. You've asked, so hang on. I think we got yours.
Robert Sheeta has.
So since this is more regulation versus law enforcement, are you guys only coming to visit us for check-ins when we need relicensing? Or can somebody complain about us? And do you do a facility check? Or is there any other reason you might show up at our door randomly like Fish and Wildlife does?
Yeah. Go for it.
Great question. So when we have a facility that's licensed and they're doing a relicense or pre-license, getting the license, that's an announced visit. Okay, so if you're applying for a license, yeah, so I'm gonna call you for that. We're gonna do that, and in 3 years we're gonna do it again. In between, I'm gonna come see you unannounced, and that's just to pop in and make sure that you're still doing everything and it wasn't a show the first time I was there. You know, I don't expect that to be the case. It never is, but we're just trying to make sure that those animals, again, we're advocates for the animals. So in between, we try to do at least once a year a visit. Now, if somebody files a complaint against you and it comes across my desk, I'm obliged to go look into complaints. So I would come and visit for that. So there could be an instance of that too.
Just a quick follow-up on the nutrition question. Just an advice for everybody that is gonna get licensed. Your attending veterinarian is your best friend. So as long as that vet approves your nutritional diet plans and your program of veterinary care, we go for it and we will approve that, and we will not question most likely anything for your design attending veterinarian unless there is a big question or an issue.
Okay, we're gonna wrap it up pretty quick. So I've got somebody here who hasn't participated yet.
The exhibitor part is very interesting because we live in a time when you can make a cute animal video and get paid instantly on Facebook or any number of things. And if you're opening yourself to inspecting all these pet owners, you're going to be very overrun very quickly. Just interesting, especially if it's not in person.
Interesting question.
Very good question.
So even online exhibition would be, you know, especially for compensation, again, meeting that definition of exhibition, that would be a regulated activity. Now, we don't know again about, you know, where David talked about, you know, exceptions and de minimis. We don't know what those are yet, right? So when that will be a determination whether or not that activity will be something that we have to regulate in terms of that overwhelming nature. Because trust me, it's something to think about all the time too.
Could you define de minimis?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's some of it's no.
I
some don't.
apologize. So de minimis are basically those exceptions to the rules because, you know, the activity is too small or too few, or it's less than that $500 rule that David showed us earlier. Like all those are things like, and those are in the regulations as well for the mammals right now. Again, we don't know what it's going to pertain to birds. Such a political answer, right?
I understand.
But for the things we can build off of what we know that's established. And yeah, so those are those exceptions that are there. The last thing I want to share is that we're here all week. So if you guys have more questions, we can probably do a part 2, part 3, part 10.
Great. That's great.
Where we have lots of breaks throughout the day and whenever. So please, even when after this end of this conference, reach out to us. We want to hear these questions. Thank you guys so much for the invitation to this. And thank you for the questions. We really appreciate the engagement. And we learn every time you guys ask us a question, we learn too. Okay.
I think what I'll do is I'll create one slide with our names and contact numbers, emails, the general locations that we cover, so everyone's kind of familiar again. So you guys have to reach out.
That's great.
Because I don't think that we all have enough cards to hand out.
Okay, there's one more before we go. Very quick announcement.
I just want to let you guys know, I'm Kirsten Cunningham. I own Everything Birds. We're one of the sponsors. We are Florida's largest bird store. We are 20 minutes away. We're at 180 Racetrack Road. We have a party planned for you this evening. We have free beer. We don't have like a dinner, but I do have like meat and cheese trays and things like that. We also have a cornhole tournament with prizes. And for anyone, the store will be open. If you choose to purchase anything, we're going to give a 5% discount to everybody, and we're going to match a 5% to ASA.
Here we go for a change of topic. I know you have more questions. There were lots of hands up.
Just write down your questions.
Write them down. They will be here. We want all your questions answered. And I can't thank you all enough for being here. This is awesome. Cody, especially, thank you for coming.
I can get the contact and
So,
I'll post it on the
Kristen,
ASA website.
For tonight's event, how are we going to organize it? What are we doing?
So if people have their own cars, they can take them. I have a Murano. I can take 4 with me, but
I was hoping that people drove and had their own. But we're at 180 Racetrack Road. It's at the back of the Oldsmar Flea Market, Building J West. Just come in the main entrance. It says Oldsmar Flea